Welcome to the Beyond Bloated Podcast. I'm Carly, a certified health coach helping women under 50 ditch their bloat without having to follow super strict and stressful protocols. As someone who's struggled with all sorts of digestive issues for over 5 years, I know exactly how you're feeling. I also know that there's a way to feel better, and it doesn't have to involve tons of expensive supplements and insanely restrictive diets. Join me as I share all of my bloat-busting wisdom to help you say goodbye to that bloated belly and regain your confidence. It's time for you to move beyond bloated. Testing, 1, 2, 3. I am on episode 13. So I decided I'm going to invest in some professional audio equipment. And by professional audio equipment, I mean a foam box. I bought this box off Amazon that's like covered in foam, and you stick your microphone inside of it, and it's supposed to help prevent like echo and feedback, all that annoying stuff you can occasionally hear in the background. So if you notice that this episode sounds worse than all the others, then that's a big problem because this is supposed to help. But if you've noticed that this episode sounds better than the others, let me know. Text me using the send me a text function that you can find the link for in the show notes. Click it. It goes to your phone, text messages, and you can text me. It's anonymous. Like, I can't see your phone number. I don't see a name. I don't know who sent it. The only thing I can see is like the last 4 digits of your phone number. So if you don't want to text me because you don't want me to have your phone number, you don't have to worry. I'm not going to have it. The other news I want to share with you before we jump into today's topic is that my Bloat Be Gone Kickstart bundle, I don't know if I mentioned earlier that that's what I'm naming my new fancy resource that I'm creating, but it's almost ready. So if you would like to be the first to know when it's released, sign up to my email list. You can do so by clicking in the show notes. There is my free ultimate guide to bloat busting. So if you haven't grabbed that yet, head to the show notes, click that link, and you just put your first name, your email. You'll receive the free guide so you can get started on beating your bloat right away with that resource. And you'll be added to my email list. So once my resource is ready, you'll be the first to hear about it. What I can tell you about it right now is that it is very comprehensive. So included is going to be a handbook. So the handbook is going to be extremely detailed, providing you with long-term and short-term solutions to your bloat and other digestive issues. There's going to be a quiz in there so you can initially assess how bad your condition is. There's some root causes, a whole bunch of information, including product recommendations. So these are not products that you have to take, but I know a lot of people want a little bonus help at the beginning. It can definitely be beneficial if you're really struggling. So I have recommended a few high quality products that I personally have used most of these myself. I think that they are worth it. So my recommendations are in there. On top of the handbook, you're going to get a anti-inflammatory recipe book with 65 recipes, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. 2 different meal plans. One is a leaky gut meal plan, and the other is a de-bloat meal plan. Both come with grocery lists, so you're going to know exactly what to get. You don't have to make the list yourself. There's also going to be a journal, a tracking journal, so you can track your symptoms, your activities, your bowel movements. It's all laid out for you. And that way you can kind of start to see what is triggering you. Yes, it may be food, but it may also be like the exercise you're doing, or you could correlate like, oh, when I get a terrible sleep, I'm super bloated. Things that you might not think of. It'll be laid out for you so you don't have to think too hard on what to track. You just fill out the journal and look for the clues. There's going to be some other stuff in there as well, but I'll leave it at that for now. I'll go into more detail when it's all ready. And if you would like to join my email list so you're the first to know, just grab that ultimate guide to bloat busting. It's completely free and you'll be added to my email list. What I actually want to talk to you today about is gluten. And gluten is a huge topic, especially when you have gut issues. Everybody talks about gluten, gluten-free this, gluten-free that. What is gluten? Who knows? Do I have celiac disease? So many questions about gluten. I'm going to answer them as best as I can right here, right now. If you yourself are not gluten-free, I can almost guarantee that you know at least one person who is. I myself am gluten-free. I have been for nearly 6 years now. My mom is gluten-free. My brother is gluten-free. My boyfriend's sister and mom are gluten-free. I have friends who are gluten-free. Like, the amount of people these days that are gluten-free is astronomical. None of us are gluten-free by choice. Like, it's not like we could eat bread from the grocery store and not suffer. I personally became gluten-free because I became sensitive to it. Every time I would eat gluten, I would get sharp stabbing pains in my gut, and then I would run to the washroom and spend some quality time with the toilet. I didn't enjoy that, so I stopped eating gluten, and I haven't touched it since. I don't actually know anybody who is gluten-free just for the hell of it. I know people who are gluten-free because they are celiac, or they are sensitive or intolerant to gluten. Some people have autoimmune conditions and gluten makes their symptoms flare, so they are choosing to be gluten-free for that reason. Lots of reasons. I'm going to touch on them as we go through this episode. What I want to make clear is that not everybody needs to be gluten-free. There are a lot of people who are gluten-free, and those people likely do need to be gluten-free, at least temporarily. It's not necessarily forever, even if in the moment you do need to cut out gluten. So this episode is also going to help you decide whether or not going gluten-free is the right choice for you, if you have not yet cut out gluten, and even if you have, but you're like, I don't know if I really need to, this is going to help clear things up for you. I'm going to start with Gluten 101. What the hell is gluten? Gluten is a structural protein found in specific grains, with wheat being the primary source. So we know wheat bread contains gluten, but it's also present in barley and rye, and its effects on health vary from person to person. So like I just said, not everybody needs to be gluten-free, but some people definitely do need to be. Gluten isn't a standalone protein. It's actually a combination of two proteins, glutenin and gliadin. These two proteins merge and they create the elastic and stretchy structure that causes bread to rise. So if you've ever cooked gluten-free bread and you're like, why doesn't this rise? It's because it's missing those two proteins. Here are some not so fun facts about gliadin. That is the protein that is responsible for triggering the immune response in people with celiac disease. Another one, a 2015 study demonstrated that gliadin can increase intestinal permeability, often referred to as leaky gut, in all individuals, not just those with celiac disease. So this means that anyone who is eating gliadin may be at risk of developing leaky gut syndrome, according to this study. One of the biggest concerns about eating gluten, specifically in North America, comes from how we process wheat in Canada and in the US. So we ultra process our wheat. Whole grains are advertised as being super healthy and good for you. Eat your whole grains, yada yada, which is true if it hasn't been ultra processed. The most nutrient-rich part of a whole grain is in the wheat kernel. It's called the bran and the germ. So those are two components of the wheat kernel that contain like 70% of the nutrients. And we remove that. We take it out because it helps with shelf life. So if you pick up any of your wheat products, like your bread bought from the grocery store, and you see terms like enriched, bleached wheat flour, anything other than 100% whole grain, that process has occurred, which means approximately 70% of the whole grain nutrients has been destroyed and removed, and you're hardly getting any benefit from that product. You also need to be very aware of product labels because the label will still say made with whole grains, even when this ultra processing of the wheat has occurred, because technically it once was a whole grain. Even though they removed the most nutrient part of it, they can still slap it on the label and make people believe that they are getting the full benefits of eating whole grains when they are definitely not. Now that we know the basics of gluten, let's jump into some reasons why a person may go gluten-free. The first one, probably most obvious, celiac disease. So that's definitely the most common and most unmistakable motive for going gluten-free. Like if you have celiac disease, you need to be gluten-free. It is not a choice. You are going to do severe damage to yourself if you eat gluten with celiac disease. Celiac disease is an autoimmune condition that is triggered when somebody eats even a tiny crumb of gluten, the body's immune system identifies gluten as a threat and starts attacking. The attack hits the small intestine. So basically, the body's immune system is attacking the small intestine, which does damage to the small intestine and can cause a huge variety of symptoms. Every person with celiac disease can experience a completely different range of symptoms. Some may not even experience symptoms. So there's a condition called asymptomatic celiac disease, where you do have celiac disease and damage is happening to your small intestine, but your body is not giving you any obvious signs or symptoms. This is rare, but it can happen. For anyone else with celiac disease, the symptoms can include digestive issues like bloating, gas, diarrhea, stomach pain, weight loss, fatigue, skin problems, anemia, joint pain, bone problems, neurological symptoms, behavioral and mood changes, and even fertility issues in women. So, like I said, massive range of symptoms, and they do not have to be digestion related. Unfortunately, there is no cure for celiac disease at this time. The only way to manage the condition is to completely eliminate gluten from your diet. And you have to be very, very cautious around gluten. So many people will have like their own set of kitchen utensils and appliances, like a toaster, especially if they live with someone who does eat gluten. That way they're preventing cross-contamination. And like when you go to a restaurant, you need to make sure the server is aware and they don't do cross-contamination. Like they use separate fryers for gluten and gluten-free things. Of course, you can still live a super awesome and fun life if you have celiac disease. You just need to be more careful, like when you eat out at restaurants or at a friend's house, and make sure that there's no cross-contamination so that you're not injuring your insides. And of course, you don't want to have symptoms that are going to ruin your time either. The most common way to test for celiac disease is just through a blood test, but the golden standard is actually a small intestine biopsy. I wouldn't personally do that if I didn't have to. So the blood test is usually good enough. The only caveat is for the blood test to yield reliable results, you need to be regularly eating gluten. So if you have been gluten-free for the last year or whatever, and then you go to do the blood test, you may get a false negative because the blood test detects antibodies in the blood, which signals an immune response to gluten. So if you aren't consuming gluten, whether or not you have celiac disease, there's going to be no antibodies because there's no gluten. So regardless, you'll get a negative result. There's something called a gluten challenge where people can eat gluten for, I believe, 6 weeks, every day for 6 weeks, and then do the test. But if you have a terrible reaction to gluten, you're not going to want to eat gluten every single day for 6 weeks. I wouldn't. So, I mean, if you know that you react to gluten in some way, you've been gluten-free and you never tested for celiac disease, I wouldn't sweat it. I mean, if you've cut out gluten and you're doing a lot better, then that's probably good enough. The second reason why someone may be gluten-free is a wheat allergy. So a wheat allergy is different from celiac disease because celiac disease is an autoimmune condition. It can be triggered at any time in a person's life, whereas allergies typically form at birth. Of course, there are exceptions, but like when you think of a peanut allergy, it's usually kids who have peanut allergies. You can test for a wheat allergy the same way you would test for any other allergy, which is usually an allergy test. So that involves like skin pricks or blood tests like the IgE blood test, which can identify the presence of wheat-specific antibodies in your blood. The symptoms of an allergy are usually different than celiac disease or a sensitivity or an intolerance. So symptoms of a wheat allergy could be like a skin reaction, like a hive or a rash, respiratory issues, trouble breathing. You can experience GI problems. That's not out of the question. It's just more rare. And in very severe cases, anaphylaxis. So that is when you need an EpiPen to save your life. The reaction to an allergy is also usually immediate, whereas the reaction to like a sensitivity or an intolerance can be delayed up to 3 days. So like if someone, for example, were to eat peanuts and they're allergic, they usually immediately know that they ate the peanuts and can't breathe or whatever their symptom is. So that's also a way to differentiate. The remedy is similar to celiac disease, where there's no cure for a wheat allergy. The only thing that you can do is avoid wheat. Moving on to the third reason why someone may be gluten-free, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which I'm just going to refer to as a gluten sensitivity. So this condition is distinct or different from celiac disease, but it's interesting because the symptoms are very similar, if not completely identical. So symptoms of a gluten sensitivity can include bloating, gas, diarrhea, stomach pain, fatigue, headaches, joint pain, nausea, mood disturbances, skin issues, and even neurological symptoms. The list that I rhymed off earlier for celiac disease, very similar to the symptoms of gluten sensitivity. The difference here is that there is no real way to diagnose a gluten sensitivity, whereas for celiac disease, you can get a blood test that can confirm, yes, you have celiac disease, whereas a gluten sensitivity, it's more like you don't have celiac disease, so you did the test while eating gluten, so you actually got accurate results and it came back negative. You don't have a wheat allergy, you tested for that. And so it's kind of like, okay, you don't have either of those. We're going to say you have a gluten sensitivity, especially when your symptoms seem to dissipate once you stop eating gluten. There are food sensitivity tests that you can do. I did one years ago, actually did it multiple times, and it every time came back saying that I was sensitive to gluten. There is controversial opinions about food sensitivity testing. There are people who say it's not scientifically backed, so it can't be accurate. I personally found my results to be very accurate. The foods that it said I was sensitive to, I noticed when I ate them, I did have a reaction. I mean, it's up to you whether or not you choose to go through with food sensitivity testing. I will say that I don't think it's necessary. I like data. I like having hard facts in front of me. I wanted the list back at the very beginning of my adventure. But I mean, if you suspect that you're intolerant or sensitive to gluten, you cut it out for a specific amount of time and you feel significantly better, you don't need a sensitivity test to tell you that you're intolerant to gluten. I think that's a pretty clear indicator. And the same applies for any food. Like if you suspect you have an intolerance to dairy, stop eating it for about 3 weeks. And if you notice significant improvements, and especially if when you try to reintroduce it, you have the same reactions come back, that's pretty clear cut. You don't need a test to confirm that you have a sensitivity to a food when that is your experience. I would say those 3 conditions, so celiac disease, a wheat allergy, and a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, are the main reasons why a person would go gluten-free. But there are a few other less common or even less well-known reasons. So number 1, I hate this term, but IBS or irritable bowel syndrome. So IBS basically just means you have gut issues. You're constantly running to the washroom. You have excessive gas. You're bloated, stereotypical GI symptoms, and you don't know what is causing it. I actually have an episode on IBS coming up next week, so stay tuned for more on that. But people who have IBS say that oftentimes they stop eating gluten, their IBS improves. But like I said, there's a whole can of worms involved with IBS, so stay tuned for next week's episode, and we'll dig into that. Another reason, autoimmune conditions. So I touched on this briefly at the beginning, but people with autoimmune conditions often report experiencing reduced inflammation and improved symptom management when going gluten-free. More specifically, conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis may show some sensitivity to dietary choices, meaning what you eat seems to have a significant impact on the severity of symptoms. The last 2 reasons that I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to combine them because they're very similar. And they also are a bit of a misconception. So people think eating gluten-free is less calories or it's automatically healthier. That is not true. So the reasons are weight management and eating clean. So people think I'm going to go gluten-free to lose weight, or I'm going to go gluten-free because I want to be healthier and everything gluten-free is healthy. So that's definitely not true. If you've ever picked up a loaf of gluten-free bread, you would know that that bad boy weighs way more than the regular bread filled with gluten. It's way more dense. It actually usually has more calories than a regular bread. But calories aren't really what's important when it comes to weight loss. It's more about the quality of the calories that you're consuming. So people actually do often lose weight going gluten-free, but it's not because the gluten-free food is automatically healthier and less calories and better for you. It's just that so much of our ultra-processed food sold in grocery stores contains gluten. So like you can no longer go even to Tim Hortons and pick up some Timbits and donuts, or you can't go to Starbucks and get your sandwich because those all have gluten in them. So you're kind of forced to stop eating out as much, or when you do eat out, you have to pick healthier options. When you go to the grocery store, you can't just pick anything off the shelf and eat it because most of it contains gluten. So you do often lose weight and eat cleaner going gluten-free, but it's not because the gluten-free products are just better for you. There are plenty of gluten-free packaged products that are just as unhealthy as the gluten versions. The difference being that these are possibly less accessible. So maybe not everyone has a huge selection of gluten-free donuts at their store. So instead of buying the gluten-free donuts, they just stop eating donuts. And even if you do have the option, it's probably 3 times more than the regular donuts. So you also might just be like, I don't really need donuts that bad. I'm just going to stop eating donuts rather than pay an astronomical amount for the gluten-free version. That's actually what happened to me when I went gluten and dairy-free almost 6 years ago. I ended up losing about 7 pounds, and I've always been thin. So it's not like my intention was to lose weight. I didn't need to lose weight. But just because I cut out gluten and dairy, I ended up losing weight because I stopped eating out so frequently. I stopped picking up so much ultra-processed junk at the grocery store. I didn't want to pay a ton of money for gluten-free cookies, so I bought them less frequently. And yeah, I ended up losing weight even though that wasn't my intention. So those are some of the reasons why people choose to be gluten-free. And now let's talk about some of the benefits and some of the drawbacks of making that choice. If at this point you're thinking, yes, I may want to be gluten-free, or I am gluten-free and want to continue down that path, here are some of the benefits that you may experience. If you are experiencing digestive issues like bloating, gas, stomach pain, all the things, going gluten-free may help alleviate some of that. I know for myself, when I went gluten and dairy-free at the same time, so I can't say one or the other was more beneficial for me, but the stomach pain and the diarrhea that I was experiencing about 15 minutes after eating pretty well stopped after I cut out those foods. It was a pretty obvious connection there. I would eat, 15 minutes would go by, I would have extreme pain in my gut, and I'd be running for the washroom. So when I stopped eating those foods, that pretty well stopped immediately as well. It's important to remember all of the symptoms that I listed earlier, because not everyone with celiac disease or a gluten sensitivity experiences GI problems. So maybe you have skin problems, or maybe you have constant brain fog, and you don't even realize that you have it until you cut out gluten and it starts to go away. And then you're like, wow, I've been living in this mystery fog for all this time, and all I had to do was switch out my bread. So if something feels off to you, like you're experiencing some kind of symptoms, I don't know, you're just not feeling great, you can always try cutting out gluten and seeing if your symptoms improve. It's not a lifelong commitment. You can just cut it out for 3 weeks and see how you feel, and then reintroduce it and see how you feel again. If you don't notice a difference, then cool. You probably are fine eating gluten. If you do notice a difference and you actually prefer when you feel good, then maybe consider giving up gluten for a longer period of time. But again, it does not have to be forever. The other benefit is what I mentioned with the unintentional weight loss. So by going gluten-free, you are automatically cutting out a lot of ultra-processed food and takeout, things like that. So you may unintentionally lose weight and start to eat cleaner, and that could help you feel better as well, even if it's not the gluten necessarily that's causing the problem. Maybe it's the extra weight, or you're having a hard time giving up ultra-processed food or cutting back on it, things like that. So cutting out gluten, even if just a temporary time, could help you get that under control. Of course, there is always a downside to every decision. So for this gluten-free choice, there are a couple drawbacks. One being the price of gluten-free food. My favorite gluten-free bread in BC costs $12 a loaf. That doesn't mean I have to buy the $12 loaf. There are more affordable options, but I like that one the best. I've tried several, and that one is by far my favorite. So I don't buy it all the time, but occasionally I will go and buy the $12 bread. Of course, it's smart to shop the sales and do your best to buy in bulk when things are on sale. But the truth is, gluten-free living is just more expensive. Now, I personally take great care of my own health, and if I have to spend extra on groceries to feel my best, then I will gladly do that. But it is still annoying, and it is something that we have to consider when making the choice to go gluten-free. However, if you have been diagnosed with celiac disease, or you suspect you have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity, that should not really be a choice. That's more of a you need to do this for your health, because if you don't, you're going to have a lot more serious problems down the line, which is going to cost you a lot more than a loaf of gluten-free bread. Another challenge of gluten-free living is the convenience factor. So you can't just blindly go out to the restaurant and order whatever you feel like off the menu. You do have to be a lot more cautious. I personally plan ahead. Like if I know I'm going out for dinner tonight, I'm checking that menu out online, and I pretty much know what I'm ordering when I get there. Same thing goes for like social events. If you're going to a wedding or a bridal shower, whatever, there's going to be food laid out. You probably don't know exactly what's going to be in all of that food. If it's a wedding, they're usually pretty good. If it's like a catered event, they're usually pretty good because there's lots of other people in this world that are gluten-free. They aren't new to the concept of gluten-free, and they typically have options. But if it's like potluck style and everyone brought their own something, hopefully your friends and family are aware of your choice to go gluten-free, and they've at least warned you what's in it, or they've prepared something for you. That's what my friends and family do. They're lovely people. If you're new to it and they're new to it and they haven't quite caught on yet, that's okay. They can learn. But I would recommend bringing something substantial as your contribution so that you know you have something that you can rely on if literally everything else is no good, which isn't usually the case. Someone brings a veggie tray or a fruit tray, something of that sort, which is gluten-free. It's like a good-bad situation, because the good news is so many people are gluten-free these days that it's become very common. If you go to a restaurant, there's options. Servers know what gluten-free is. My friends and family know what gluten-free is. They know I'm gluten-free. People are just a lot more aware. The options in the grocery stores are a lot better than they used to be. The food is good. It's more expensive, but at least it's tasty. The bad part of it is gluten-free is so common now because everybody has gut issues because our food is trash. That's a problem. But, at least us gluten-free people are able to eat and enjoy it. But it's just sad that the reasoning is because everyone is getting sick. If at this point you're thinking, yeah, I do want to try going gluten-free, but I have no idea where to start, let me help you. Step 1, if you're making the choice to go gluten-free, you need to full commit. I know people who are like, yeah, I'm gluten-free, but I eat it every other day, or I'll eat a little thing once a week. That's not really the way to go if you're in the trial period, especially because, like, for example, a person with celiac disease, if they have even a tiny crumb of gluten, they are going to have a reaction. So you need to full commit, cut out gluten for the amount of time that you've decided. I always recommend 3 weeks. If you're doing this for 3 weeks, cut out gluten for 3 weeks. It's just 3 weeks. You can start to reintroduce it once you're done and see how you feel. But if you're going to do it right. Otherwise, I would say don't bother. If you're in and you're like, yes, I'm committing to this for at least 3 weeks, start by cleaning out your kitchen. So if you have the tempting crackers and breads laying around, that's going to make it a lot harder for you to stick to the gluten-free diet. Move it out of sight or give it to someone. I don't know. It depends who you live with, I guess. But at least move it off to a shelf that like you don't use. Maybe have your own dedicated gluten-free shelf, your own section of the fridge and freezer. And that's the spots you look at. You don't look elsewhere to tempt yourself. And make sure you read the labels, because even condiments, like you might think, oh, I'm going to have this soy sauce on my shelf because it's just soy sauce. You flip it over, contains gluten. Read the labels of the foods that you're keeping as gluten-free and make sure they do not have gluten, and then move everything else out of sight, out of mind. Now, I'm a strong believer that a gluten-free diet isn't restrictive. I know you might think I'm insane for saying that, especially if you are not gluten-free, but for someone who's been doing this for 6 years, I'm telling you, I do not feel restricted. I go to any restaurant I want. I eat all my favorite meals. I make all the snacks and the desserts that I feel like having. I am not restricted. So what you're going to do now is discover all of the gluten-free alternatives of your favorite foods so you also don't feel restricted. If you are saying, I don't want to go gluten-free because I love hamburgers, go find gluten-free hamburger buns or gluten-free burgers, because yes, burger patties can have gluten in them. They use wheat crumbs to hold them together. You can look up recipes for gluten-free cake, brownies, lasagna, pizza, whatever it is you want. There is a gluten-free alternative, and they taste good unless you find a garbage recipe. I'm not saying that there's not going to be a learning curve, and it's going to take you time to find like your favorite gluten-free products and recipes and how to bake gluten-free, things like that. But once you figure it out, you're not going to feel restricted. I'm telling you, I don't feel restricted. It did take me time to figure it out. Went through a lot of different gluten-free products to find the good ones. Now I make everything and anything that I want, and it's delicious. Another tip that I'm going to give if this is like your gluten-free trial period is to keep a food journal. So this can be something where you track what you eat, how you feel, things like bowel movements, bloating, like a scale from 1 to 10, things like that. And I know it's like, I don't want to do that. That's too much work. But it's really going to be helpful because 3 weeks from now, you're not going to remember how you felt on day 1. You think you will, but you don't. That's 3 weeks have gone by. You might have been like a 7 bloating on day 1. And by week 3, now you're like a 4. And since you're still kind of bloated, you're like, no, didn't work. I'm still bloated. This sucks. But you've actually gone from a 7 to a 4 in just 3 weeks. So that is an improvement that you might not notice unless you note it down. Obviously, you don't have to. You can do whatever you want. But I would recommend tracking just for that trial period, so you do have something to reference back on, see where you started, where you end, and was it worth it? Like, did it improve your symptoms? I want to leave you with a reminder that gluten-free does not automatically equal healthy. So there are lots of products out there that don't contain gluten that are still unhealthy foods. So if you're just replacing gluten pizza for gluten-free pizza and gluten donuts for gluten-free donuts, and that's all you're eating, you're not really going to feel better. The biggest thing I'm going to stress is to read labels, not just to look for gluten. Obviously, if you're going gluten-free, you need to look for gluten, but also look for other things like how much sugar is in this product. Are there any unhealthy fats? How much? What other ingredients are in there? Like, is there artificial flavors, artificial sweeteners, things that are going to disrupt the gut? Read the labels of everything you buy. It's so important, and it's really going to help you improve your gut health in the long run. And then just make sure you're eating balanced meals whenever you can. So the best way to do that is make sure you have a protein source. So chicken, steak, beef, tofu, whatever you want, that's on your plate. A whole grain that is gluten-free. So you could do quinoa, brown rice, oats, buckwheat, something like that. Vegetables, of course. The more colorful, the better. Healthy fats. So something like an avocado, nuts, seeds, extra virgin olive oil. Those are all great choices. Limit your sugar intake and eat at home as much as you can. That's going to help reduce your ultra processed food intake, your takeout, your fast food. It doesn't mean you can never eat that stuff. I eat that stuff still, but I eat at home most of the time. I would say I eat out maybe once a week. The rest of the time, I'm eating at home. That is how I improved my gut health. That is why I am feeling so much better than I did 6 years ago. Just try your hardest to eat at home. It's also way easier to eat gluten-free when you're at home because you're not tempted by all the gluten out in the world. I actually have an episode on that coming out in a few weeks as well. So stay tuned, and we're going to help you learn how to eat delicious meals at home in a few weeks. So there you go. That's my 2 cents on going gluten-free. I am gluten-free myself, been this way for 6 years. I don't feel restricted. I don't have the desire to add gluten back into my diet. Maybe one day that'll change, but for now, I'm good living the way I'm living. For me, going gluten-free was like the gateway drug into gut health. Going gluten-free was one of the first things I did in my gut health journey, going gluten and dairy-free at the same time, but still. And I noticed how much better I felt immediately, and that made me think like, wow, if this is possible by just not eating gluten and dairy, what else is possible? And it spiraled, and 6 years later, here I am, a certified health coach, helping other women do the same things. That being said, if you need help going gluten-free, deciding if you should be gluten-free, all of the above, reach out to me on Instagram at beyond.bloated, or send me an email, carlyclose@beyondbloated.com, or you can book an appointment, free 20-minute consult on my website, beyondbloated.com, and we can chat and see what the next steps are for you and how I can help you reach those goals. I hope this episode helped clear up the whole to be or not to be gluten-free fiasco going on in your brain, and I will talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to the Beyond Bloated podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to share this podcast with your fellow gut goddesses. If you'd like to chat about today's episode, send me a DM on Instagram at beyond.bloated. Until next time, bye!